And that is a huge opportunity for those of us who live work, who are focused on work, workers, and the workplace. We now understand that we've got to move our mental models to where work is. This is the essence of the challenge that we are facing in this fourth industrial era. But this slide, I think, gives you even more color. It's enough to say that this is a challenge, but I'd like to point out 3 areas. The velocity of change. I don't know about you, but many of the things that we see right now, I could not have dreamt of. I did not think that technology would bring us where we are today. It's nothing that we could have dreamed up in our wildest years. And what we've seen is how long it has taken over time to get to these major milestones. I talked about the telephone and the television. Those are fairly recent concepts. And if you go back and think about the types of equipment we used to have, if you had a telephone, it was that big, and it was only for the super wealthy. If you had a television, it was that big, and it was a piece of furniture that took up a lot of space in your home. And now they put them on walls. Now, in fact, you can carry the television essentially in the palm of your hand. All of this has happened in a very short period of time. The Internet of Things, all of this is getting to this really important point that we expect will happen fairly soon. It's singularity, a hybrid between the human and the machine. They will coexist. This has huge implications for those of us who are focused on talent. The other thing that's happening, as you see, is life expectancy. As I was doing my research for this talk, I realized that in this region, you'll have 77 years on average to live. We're expecting that may stretch out to 90 within our lifetimes because of modern technology and the advancements. That has huge implications for workforce development, workforce planning, the idea that individuals who retire at 55, we may begin to see that stretch out. In the United States now, it is not at all uncommon for us to be bringing 70-year-olds back into the workplace. We don't have the advantages that you have of a young population. We have a growing older population, and because our young people did not have children, they did not procreate, we've had a slowdown in our birth rate. We have a real need to bring older workers back into the workplace, thus creating a ton of issues for us from a multi-generational workforce management perspective. Imagine keeping a 70-year-old and a 27-year-old happy at once. It is a challenge that we are all welcoming, but it's brought upon us because of the level of adaptation that we are seeing in the workplace. This highlights, and the paradigm shifts, if you look at the last mark here, it's happening so quickly now, every time we turn. We predict at SHRM that several of the jobs, in fact the statistic is about 60% of the jobs that exist today won't exist a decade from now. So for all of the higher education work that we're doing, preparing students for jobs, many of those jobs won't even exist, and therefore it is critical from an HR perspective, and as government employers and government policymakers and people who think about this, that we think a lot about creativity, adaptability, and agility as we are educating employees of the future, because we can't prepare them for the jobs that you don't even know about. You have to prepare them to attack and analyze, solve problems, and you do that through those skills. I was meeting with a group of young people the other day, and I talked to them about the problems of the world being very complicated. And one of the kids looked at me, she was a 21-year-old. It's nice to be able to call a 21-year-old kid, but she said to me, she said, that's a very old term. It's dated. We don't say things are complicated anymore. We say things are complex. And she says it's more than nuance, it's more than a word. This generation thinks very differently when we think about the millennials and the Generation Z who are following, who are now coming into the workplace. They don't deal with complicated matters necessarily. Their focus is largely on complex organizations, problems, and people dynamics. Again, that has huge implications for the work that we do in human resources and human capital management. So, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about, in my last 10 minutes or so, the challenges that you will face, that we will all face, that those of you who represent governments around the region are going to face as we deal with this new generation, the fourth industrial revolution, as we realize that work is changing, workers are changing, the workplace is changing, as we begin to think about the implications for immigration in other parts of the world, and indeed this part of the world. There are huge consequences to this, but what we know for sure is that those who get the best talent will win. That is absolutely a truism, we know this. About 3 weeks ago, I found myself coming from Japan, actually coming out of Japan for a meeting, and I was meeting with CEOs around the globe. I went back to a place called Sarasota, Florida, to meet with the Fortune 250, which are the 250 largest US publicly traded companies. And I met with their CEOs, an august room of people like you all. And I asked them, what keeps you up late at night? There were two categories of conversation. Day one was on customer engagement. That is making sure that they know how to engage their customers to generate revenue. Day two, and the entire day two, was on people engagement and employee engagement. They understood more and more so than ever in our lifetimes, that a focus on people is going to be critical to them succeeding. Organizations will lose if they cannot get the best talent within their organizations. But keeping the best talent is going to win the war. There is a major difference. Too many organizations have spent significant amounts of time recruiting the best talent. They woo them, they follow them, they pay them, they do the things that they need to do to get them in the door, and then magically they lose them. They cannot hold on to the talent. And many of you may sit here and think, well, we sort of have our people, but because the world is increasingly flat, opportunities, mobility is now real. Your children don't believe they have to live here in the region. It would be nice, and they will if there's adequate opportunity, but the worst case scenario for you is if they think they need to go elsewhere to get challenging, high quality, good work. They will do it. The challenge isn't just not working for government, it is potentially they choose not to work in this part of the world. This is the reality. So we've got to be very thoughtful. I would encourage each of you as leaders, as you go back to different parts of the region, to focus not only on getting the best talent, because you'll absolutely need that to win the battle, but to win the war, you're going to have to keep the best talent. And that, as we know at the Society for Human Resource Management, requires very intentional, focused human capital interventions. I want to talk just a little bit about what we know, and we're hearing from, in particular, the millennial generation. We have about 15 or 20 PhDs on staff back in Washington, D.C. They are statisticians, researchers, IO psychologists, and they do nothing but focus on people and understanding the human experience, and they really understand the nuance of what people tell you versus what they actually mean. And so I've asked them to tell me, what do we hear from this talent? What do we hear from them that is necessary to keep them in your organizations? And three things immediately come to mind. Number one, this generation requires purpose. They must have purpose in their work. It's not enough to just pay them. It's not enough to just give them titles. That is so yesterday. Those are complicated problems that we resolved. In the new complex world, there is a focus on purpose. There's a higher meaning. They need to know that what they do actually matters. Even if it is menial work, there's an understanding that as a new worker, you may have to do lower level work. Everything that you do coming in out of business school won't necessarily be high level strategic thinking, but it is incredibly important to this group that they understand purpose. And I'll share with you a specific example. I joined SHRM after 25 years in corporate industry, sometimes as the head of HR, sometimes as general counsel, and sometimes as the CEO of a company. I came out of the media business, working for Viacom, Paramount Pictures, etc. The internet. I was in Silicon Valley when we bought the first search engine from the UK, Ask Jeeves, and I ran a part of that search engine business. What I know though is that while we were able to attract talent in the past with money, title, location, and brand, increasingly we've got to give them purpose. I joined SHRM though just about a year ago as its CEO, and we have 500 or so employees in the Washington, D.C. area. And what I immediately learned as I met with groups of employees, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes in small groups, trying to understand why do they choose to come to SHRM? More importantly, why do they choose to remain at SHRM? Consistently, they said, it's not enough to say you want us to create great customer experiences for SHRM members, great membership experiences. I want to know why does that matter? And I'm going to tell you, we ultimately came up with our new tagline, better workplaces, better world, because we heard our employees talk about the importance of purpose. They need to know that what they do matters and will tie into a better world. I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but purpose is something that each of you, whether you are HR practitioners in the room or you manage large groups of people, you've got to figure out how to ensure that people understand on a very individual basis purpose. The second thing is that they must have training and career development, meaningful training. Everyone understands that, as I mentioned earlier, because the technologies will change every 3 to 4 or 5 years, that you're going to have to constantly train. But what we heard from young, talented people is that you must also invest in their career development. And career development doesn't necessarily mean giving them a $70,000 a year MBA at Harvard. It doesn't mean sending them to the best conferences around the world. It may mean some of that, but it's as much about mentoring. It's about teaching them how they can assume the roles that you now assume, the positions that you currently hold. It's about ensuring that they have individualized, we call them IDPs, individualized development plans. This is the new era. If you're going to get the talent, to keep them, not only purpose, but training and development is critical. The third area is a maniacal focus on culture. Now this is something that I want to pause because I have one more slide and then I'm going to take my seat. But what we know, the number one reason that individuals leave an organization is because there is a lack of culture, cultural fit, cultural awareness, or being true to culture. As I met with these groups of CEOs over the last several years now, and in this last year in particular, I've been talking with them, and we back in the United States have a Me Too problem. You've all heard about it. Sexual harassment is rampant. Pay disparity, women are not being treated properly in the workplace. This is one of the biggest issues to hit our country, and it has global implications. And we've always believed, and I as a former lawyer believe, that you can pass legislation to fix that. You can announce rules, you can have posters, you can punish people severely who violate these. But at the end of the day, you can't pass enough legislation to fix Me Too problems, workplace harassment problems. This is an issue of culture.